overdue reckoning with racist symbols on our public lands. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair because there are votes. So we will have to break for that. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Anyone present in the hearing room today must wear a mask, covering their mouth and nose. The Speaker of the House and the Sergeant at Arms, acting upon the recommendation of the attending physician, require face coverings for all indoor gatherings over 15 minutes in length, such as committee meetings. Accordingly, to maintain decorum and protect the safety of members and staff, the chair will not recognize any member in this hearing room to speak who is not wearing a mask. According to House Rule 17 and Committee Rule 3D, the chair retains the right of recognition of any member who wishes to speak or offer a motion. This right includes the responsibility to maintain decorum. And thank you all for attending today's Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands legislative hearing on 3 bills that grapple with the ramifications of Confederate statues, memorials, and symbols in public spaces throughout the country. I would like to start by welcoming the bill sponsors as well as the distinguished panel of witnesses joining us today to speak about this critical issue. I would also like to acknowledge the fact that there are not any Republican bills on today's agenda and recognize that this may cause some frustration among my colleagues on the other side of the dais. Throughout my tenure as chair of the subcommittee, approximately 1/3 of the bills scheduled for hearings have come from Republican sponsors. I remain committed to finding opportunities for bipartisanship and am hopeful that we can even find some consensus on the issues before us today. The national reckoning on racism and injustice precipitated by the tragic murder of George Floyd makes it clear that today's conversation is not only necessary but long overdue. I can't imagine that more than 150 years after the end of the Civil War, President Lincoln would have expected us to still be coming to terms with the legacy of slavery, racial discrimination, and inequality that the Confederacy fought to uphold. When it comes to our national parks and public lands, the least we can do is challenge ourselves to question the origin and meaning of the symbols we choose to display. President Trump has defended Confederate monuments as our heritage and spoken of their artistic beauty. Whatever artistic beauty that may exist in a statue or individual memorial is irrelevant, and it bears mentioning that many Confederate commemorative works were established decades later at the peak of Jim Crow, not so subtle reminder of the hate and bigotry that still permeates our society today. As we'll hear from our witnesses today, many communities across the country have begun to remove statues and other symbols of the Confederacy from parks and other public spaces. Yes, some have been removed or toppled by protesters, but just this month alone, 19 statues have been removed. Only 3 were taken down by protesters. I point this out not to condone the unsanctioned removal of statues, but as a reminder that without government and community action, these symbols will continue to perpetuate racism and inspire hate and malice on both sides of this issue, especially on public lands, which often have a racist history of their own. It is essential that we tell a story that can be embraced by all Americans. This is not about erasing history. Museums and historic battlefields will continue to tell the story of the conflict and circumstance that led to the Confederacy taking up arms against the United States. But our shared heritage need not glorify the hate, bigotry, and intolerance that resulted in a war that claimed more American lives than any other in U.S. history. Because let us be clear, the Civil War was fought over slavery. That is not a subject for debate. As a country, we must strive to be better, to embrace justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in all aspects of our lives. The reckoning on names and statues should not stop at the Confederacy either. Looking forward, I hope we can also take steps to address other places throughout the country, forests, wilderness areas, mountaintops that now have names that glorify individuals responsible for committing unspeakable atrocities. Importantly, we also need to invest in education and interpretation to ensure that this history is not lost, or else we are dooming ourselves to repeat it. Unfortunately, rather than prioritize education, President Trump has decided to focus on a few acts of petty vandalism to justify sending anonymous federal troops into our cities to kidnap and harass our citizens, often over the objections of local governors, mayors, and other civic leaders. This is not how we heal and move forward together as a society, something that we are still seeking 150 years after President Lincoln's second inaugural address, which was delivered only weeks before General Lee's surrender at Appomattox and Lincoln's assassination at Ford's Theater right here in Washington, D.C. The last line of that now famous speech, he said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just, lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." Clearly, we are still striving for that just and lasting peace, and hope today's conversation can help us move toward that seemingly elusive goal. And with that, I'll recognize our ranking member, Mr. Curtis, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for your remarks, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. The subcommittee has before us today 3 bills related to monuments and memorials, which include symbols or depict figures associated with the Confederacy. The first, H.R. 970, offered by Congressman Brown of Maryland, would remove a statue of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee from the National Battlefield statue, which is placed on private property in 2003 and was purchased by the National Park Service in 2005. Next, we have H.R. 4135, offered by Congressman Holmes Norton of D.C., which would remove the statue of Albert Pike. That statue, though intended to honor Pike's service as a Freemason rather than his service as a Confederate general, has been the source of controversy since before it was erected in 1901. Recently, the statue was torn down from its pedestal and set ablaze. Finally, we have H.R. 7550, offered by Congressman McEwen of Virginia, which would require a multi-agency study to inventory Confederate symbols and monuments located on federal lands. I commend the authors of the legislation before us today. The legislative process, which will provide a variety of diverse opinions through elected representation, is the appropriate avenue to make the decisions about which statues should be on public property. I believe this hearing can serve as an opportunity to hear a variety of views, and I'm particularly interested to learn the underlying principles that determine what should or should not be put on public property. I hope we all agree that vandalism is never the answer, especially when there is a legal route to change. While there have been some high-profile vandalism of Confederate statues and memorials, other acts of vandalism have targeted more broadly supported statues. For example, unknown vandals in New York tore down a statue of the abolitionist icon Frederick Douglass. Other vandals in Wisconsin tore down the statue of Hans Christian Heg and decapitated it. Heg fought for the Union during the Civil War, and it was a fierce opponent of slavery and an early member of the anti-slavery Free Soil Party. A statue memorial of George Washington in Baltimore was graffitied with paint, and in San Francisco, protesters defaced and toppled the statue of former President Grant, who led the Union Army during the Civil War. Replacing our country's legal framework with mob rule is a threat to our representative democracy. We're lucky to live in a country where it's even possible to petition our leaders through a deliberatory process, and the day we'll no longer have the right, the day we no longer have that right, America will cease to exist as we know it. The United States is the leader of the free world, and no nation in history has done more to defend the principles of liberty and freedom. That said, our founding fathers understood that our nation was imperfect from its conception. The preamble to the Constitution states, in order to form a more perfect union. We remain an imperfect union today. The American experiment in representation democracy is and always will be a work in progress. Our founding fathers were not perfect people. None of us are. But despite their flaws, we should continue to honor them for the monumental feat they undertook to successfully fight for our freedom, then set up a system to sustain that freedom. We should be able to discuss their historical figures and their admirable traits as well as the less admirable traits. I believe that 100 years from now, our great-grandchildren will look back at us with disappointment for some of our actions that may seem or feel acceptable today. Despite earnestly trying our best, history has shown that judgment uses a different paradigm many years down the road. I hope we in Congress can work together to elevate our public discourse and have nuanced and thoughtful debate on these important topics. The best part of my job as a member of Congress, and I wish I could give to every American, is a day of service in my shoes. It's getting to hear and learn from diverse perspectives from across the country. Despite my best efforts this year to stay 59 years old, I'm now 60, white, gray, and injured. I'm an old guy from Utah, coming from a state without direct ties to a confederacy. I am excited and I need this opportunity to learn and listen. And I hope these conversations today can unite us in a way that will bring us back home together. Therefore, one of my primary goals of this hearing is to understand what my colleagues on both sides of the aisle feel should be underlying framework determining if a statute should remain or be removed. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you so much, Ranking Member Curtis. Now I would like to turn to our first panel and welcome the members of Congress who wish to testify on the bills they have sponsored. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use the grid view so they may pin the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. We'll also allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Brown, for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, before we begin the clock, can I just ask, I know each committee is slightly different. Is it proper in this committee that when members or witnesses present and during that presentation only, we can remove our face masks? Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Holland and Ranking Member Curtis. I want to thank also Chairman Grijalva for having me here today and for including H.R. 970, the Robert E. Lee Statute Removal Act, as part of today's legislative hearing. I also want to thank my colleagues, Congresswoman Norton and Congressman McEachin, for their work on this issue. We're all incredibly proud of our national parks and public lands. They preserve the natural landscapes and represent part of the intricate tapestry of our national history. And that history can be painful. Yet we are reminded that we have not had an honest accounting of that history. And for too long, we've been blind to the way past injustices continues to shape the present. The question before us today is straightforward. Do Confederate flags and monuments have any place in our national parks? To answer this question, I simply ask myself what these statutes and symbols commemorate. The glorification of the Confederacy, its traitorous leaders, their cause of slavery and open rebellion against the United States of America. In my mind, there's only one side in the Civil War we should be honoring, the United States, and all those Americans in both the North and South who fought against those who tried to divide our country and perpetuate a system of systemic oppression and racial subjugation. And therefore, it is time for these monuments to come down. These statutes and monuments were built in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by Confederate apologists, segregationists, and opponents of civil rights. They recast Confederate soldiers as heroes fighting for a supposed lost cause and celebrated their traitorous leaders. And the heyday of monument building, a period that began in 1890 and spanned to 1920, was also a time of extreme racial violence. Violence that we saw again during the 1960s and 1970s when white Southerners pushed back against what little progress had been made by Black Americans. As monuments went up, Black men, women, and children were being lynched. The Confederate monuments served as a reminder of the power that white supremacists could and would exert over Black bodies. These monuments became beacons of white supremacy and symbols of an effort to intimidate Black Americans into seeing themselves as inferior and less than. These monuments do nothing to teach us of the dark lessons of our history, but are the very center of the white supremacist racist imagination. My bill would remove but one of many such works from federal land. This statue of Robert E. Lee on Antietam battlefield, the place where more Americans died in a single day, was commissioned with the explicit intent of honoring the Confederacy and built in 2003, 138 years after the end of the Civil War. The 24-foot statue of Lee is not historically accurate, and despite an inscription stating otherwise, honors a man who fought to preserve the institution of slavery. There is no reason why any of our nation's public spaces should be defiled by monuments to those who betrayed their country. And as a nation, we can decide between those figures and causes who deserve to be honored and those who do not. Public land should not be home to symbols of hate and bigotry that memorialize leaders who fought for disunion and oppression. Statutes and monuments ought to celebrate the brave individuals who have fought and died in our country and true American values. Removing the monument at Antietam and those across our country is not an insult to any state or region. It would simply be an acknowledgement that the cause for which they fought, the cause of slavery, was wrong, that the imposition of Jim Crow and violent resistance to civil rights and economic advancement for all people was wrong. While there is much more yet to be done and we have a long way to go, today could be an important step towards truly transforming this country for the better and again taking a step towards forming a more perfect union. For those who are concerned that by removing these statutes we will erase history and somehow be destined to relive that history, I simply say that Confederate soldiers and the Confederacy itself will continue to be written about and studied as a part of the dark history of our nation. There will be appropriate settings, perhaps like museums or libraries, where physical objects will be found that remind us of the insidious effort to defend the violent institution of slavery. We need not honor this with statutes and monuments in public spaces such as national parks. Even Robert E. Lee opposed the construction of monuments commemorating the vanquished Confederacy. A year before his death in 1870, Lee also declined an invitation to attend an event that commemorated a planned memorial at the Battle of Gettysburg, just 44 miles northeast of Antietam. He said, "I think it wiser, moreover, not to keep open the sores of war, but to follow the examples of those nations who endeavored to obliterate the marks of civil strife, to commit to oblivion the feelings engendered." Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton.
I thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing. I thank your fellow committee members, and I thank your fellow panelists. I also thank you for allowing me to testify on my bill to permanently remove the statue of Confederate General Albert Pike from federal land near Judiciary Square in the nation's capital. This statute was authorized not by the District of Columbia, but by Congress in 1898 when the district had no home rule, that is to say, self-government authority. The statute was constructed using both federal and private funds. The Freemasons, of which Pike was a member, donated the money, or much of it, needed to build and install the statute in 1901. The Freemasons themselves support the statute's removal. I've written with them, and they say, given its divisive nature, it's time for it to go. Although the statute was taken down last month during a demonstration, President Trump reportedly has called for the statute to be put back up. I believe Confederate statutes should be placed in museums, as valuable historical artifacts when combined with the story of their meaning in our history. Pike was a Confederate general who served dishonorably and was forced to resign in disgrace. It was found that soldiers under his command mutilated the bodies of Union soldiers and Pike was ultimately imprisoned after his fellow officers reported that he had misappropriated funds. Adding to the dishonor of taking up arms against the United States, Pike dishonored even his Confederate military service. He certainly has no claim to be memorialized in the nation's capital. Even those who do not want Confederate statues removed should have to justify awarding Pike any honor considering this history. After meeting with the Freemasons in 2017, I decided that the best course of action would be to remove the statue and find a more appropriate place for it. Though my bill does not explicitly say where the statue should be placed, I believe that relocating this statue to a museum and adding historical context would be the most appropriate option. The DC Mayor and the DC Council also support the removal of the statue. In 2017, the DC Council unanimously passed a resolution calling on Congress to remove the statue. Later in this hearing, you will hear testimony from Dr. Frank Smith, director of the African American Civil War Museum, the tireless advocate for the 209,145 Black Americans who fought for freedom as members of the United States colored troops during the Civil War. These brave men fought against the Confederacy and General Albert Pike to end slavery and keep the United States under one flag. Madam Chair, I appreciate the hearing. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this legislation. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ms. Norton. I thank the sponsoring members of Congress for their valuable testimony. Now we will transition to our second panel. As with the first panel, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be made part of the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. After the witnesses have testified, the members will be given the opportunity to ask questions. The chair now recognizes Reverend Robert Wright Lee, descendant of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee.
To Chairwoman Deborah Holland and the members of the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands. I'm here to give testimony in regard to H.R. 970 and the broader conversation regarding Confederate monuments. As with anything I do, I'm acutely aware I could not do this alone without the people who help along the way. I am grateful to Congressman Anthony Brown for the bill, for Kaylee Darty, my counsel today from my hometown, and for most importantly, my wife Stephanie, who is at home working, but helped copy edit my testimony. I also want to acknowledge the reality in the room and the reason that I am here. I am not the first Robert Lee to testify before the United States Congress. One did in 1866 during Reconstruction. It is indeed another person who bears a first and surname identical to mine, and whose lineage I bear as a nephew of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. But I've been clear that I dare not speak for my entire family or for even the general himself, as some still revere him and see no reason for this hearing today. I will instead let the famed Confederate soldier speak for himself, as his documented testimony before Congress can be found easily in your records. When asked before Congress and the country if Black American citizens were equally capable of acquiring knowledge as white Americans, that, Robert Lee said, I do not think that he is capable of acquiring knowledge as the white man is. There are some more apt than others. I have known some to acquire knowledge and skill in their trade or profession. I've had servants of my own who learned to read and write very well. Lee was later asked by a senator from Missouri during the same hearing if Southern states should allow the suffrage of Black Americans. Lee remarked, my own opinion is that at this time they cannot vote intelligently, and that giving them the right of suffrage would open the door to great deals of demagogism and lead to embarrassments in various ways. I raise these two statements and moments from the other Robert Lee's testimony to highlight the difference and dissonance from what this Robert Lee is about to say. I fully believe, along with a host of other amazing citizens of this great country, that Black lives matter. And for us to continue to celebrate a man who questioned the education, disparaged the right to vote of Black life, and had previously fought for the continued enslavement of Africans on the North American continent is an affront to those now who are suffering under current weights of oppression. That said, I want to uplift two people who ultimately shared that with me. One was Janie Bowman, my Black nanny in the South in the 1990s, who sang the sweet hour of prayer while I slept in her arms when my parents worked. Though she's not on this earth today, I know in the hereafter she, along with countless others who experienced racism and bigotry and white supremacy, are cheering you all on to show that the cost of following what's right might not be politically expedient, but it is incredibly good. Likewise, my confirmation mentor, a strong woman of color named Bertha Hamilton, taught me that I could take my Confederate symbols down and still live to tell the tale. She implored me to remove a flag and a picture I had in my room because she saw my life, my calling, as more valuable than these symbols. I'm here today to say the same is true for all of you. If we are honest, the answer is clear. We cannot remain complicit with these monuments. We cannot remain silent anymore. If we do so, our silence becomes agreement and endorsement to complicity. The statue at Antietam and the bill that it represents and statues everywhere must be removed for a more perfect union, which is inclusive of a better tomorrow and a better United States. I will close by saying that as much as I love the history of my family and the study therein, I am most avidly an armchair presidential historian. Many presidents, from President Kennedy, President Reagan, and President Obama, have compared these United States to a shining city on a hill. While I acknowledge that all of these three presidents were incredible orators and public speakers, the notion of a city on a hill is a distinctly spiritual one, an area I hope, at least as a pastor, that I know well. In the Christian New Testament, Matthew's gospel states, "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket." Friends, we are on a hill. I call on this committee and this Congress to pass this bill not because of erasing history, but on the fact that the American people have lit a light that is no longer hidden. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pastor Lee, Reverend Lee. The chair now recognizes the Honorable Mitch Landrieu, founder of E Pluribus Unum and former mayor of the city of New Orleans.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson and Ranking Member Curtis, the other members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to discuss the important matter of Confederate symbols. I'm also humbled to be with the other presenters today who have been eloquent. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you this morning. As the chairperson said, my name is Mitch Landrieu. I'm the president and founder of E Pluribus Unum, appropriately named after our nation's founding motto, "Out of many we are one." Our goal is to help advance racial and economic equity across America. I also served as mayor of the city of New Orleans from 2010 to 2018, Louisiana's lieutenant governor from 2004 to 2010, and I had the joy of being in the House of Representatives on the state level for 16 years. As many of you know, as mayor of New Orleans, I removed 4 Confederate statues from public land with a process that started in 2015 and ended in May of 2017 with the removal of a Robert E. Lee statue from the city's most prominent circle. That process helped reintroduce historical facts and a more proper telling of the history of how and why many of these statues or monuments were put up in the first place. The historic record is now clear. Most statues of Confederate leaders were erected not just to honor these men, but as part of a movement which has now become known as the cult of the lost cause. This lost cause had one goal: through monuments and other means, to rewrite history, to hide the truth, which is that the Confederacy was on the wrong side of humanity. It sought to continue to oppress Black Americans and Black lives. James W. Lowe, a retired University of Vermont professor and the author of Lies Across America, What Our Historic Sites Get Wrong, put it very succinctly in a Washington Post op-ed. He quotes, "The Confederates won with the pen and the noose, what they could not win on the battlefield. That is the cause of white supremacy and the dominant understanding of what the war was all about. We are still digging ourselves out from under this misinformation they spread, which is manifested in our public monuments and our history books." Those quotes. According to the work of the Southern Poverty Law Center, there are some 700 Confederate memorial monuments and statues erected well after the Civil War. There are over 1,000 streets, buildings, and other markers named after Confederate leaders. According to their research, 2 distinct periods saw a significant rise in the dedication of monuments and other symbols. The first began around 1900, amid the period which states were enacting Jim Crow laws to disenfranchise the newly freed African Americans and to resegregate society. This spike lasted well into the 1920s, a period that saw a dramatic resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, which has been born in the middle and in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. The second spike began in the early 1950s and lasted through the 1960s as the civil rights movement led to a backlash among segregationists. These 2 periods also coincided with the 50th and 100th anniversaries of the Civil War. In summary, the South lost the war, and a group of people got together and decided that they were going to adorn the country with monuments that revered those who fought on behalf of a cause that was lost, which they wanted to make seem noble. It was a propaganda campaign of epic proportions. You see, these statues are not just stone and metal. They're not just innocent remembrances of a benign history. These monuments purposefully celebrate and perpetuate a fictional, sanitized Confederacy, ignoring the death, the enslavement, and the terror that they actually stood for. The truth is that they were fighting for the right to own and sell Black human beings. History cannot be changed. It cannot be moved like a statue. What is done is done. The Civil War is over and the Confederacy lost, and we are all the better for it. But in this, the 20th year of the 21st century, we should not debate whether the United States of America should revere the Confederacy. It is self-evident that these men did not fight for the United States of America. They fought to destroy it. They may have been warriors, but they certainly were not patriots. Ultimately, as a country, we must grapple with a simple notion. There is a difference between remembrance of history and the reverence of it. To literally put the Confederacy on a pedestal is an inaccurate recitation of our full past. It is an affront to our present, and it is a bad prescription for our future. It ensures that all of our fellow brothers and sisters once fought and will still continue. As President George W. Bush said at the dedication ceremony for the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a great nation does not hide its history. It faces its flaws and it corrects them. Members, you now have the opportunity to do your part to correct this past. This is an important but small first step. So let me close with a plea to our collective humanity. I noted in a speech upon removing the monuments that a friend had asked me to consider these monuments from the perspective of an African-American mother or father trying to explain to their 5th grade daughter who Robert E. Lee is and why he is revered with this statue. Can any of you look into this child's eyes and convince her that Robert E. Lee is there to encourage her? Do you think that she will feel inspired and hopeful? Do these monuments help her see a future with limitless potential? Have you ever thought that if her potential is limited, ours is too? We all know the answers to these very simple questions. When you look into this child's eyes is the moment when the searing truth comes into focus. This is the moment when we know what is right and what we must do. We cannot continue to walk away from this truth. We must remove all these Confederate symbols that dirty the soil of our beloved country. Once that is done, we can better confront the racist systems that have divided us by design from the beginning of our beloved country for generations, so that we can get closer to be the more perfect union that we all aspire to be. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mayor Landrieu. The chair now recognizes Dr. Frank Smith, Director of the African American Civil War Museum.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My name is Frank Smith, and I'm the founding director of the African American Civil War Museum in Washington, D.C. For several years, 16 years, I was a council member from the District of Columbia. I come today to support H.R. 4135, the bill to direct Secretary of the Interior to remove a statue of the memory and honor of Albert Pike. I came today to support this bill because I think monuments that occupy public space should be restricted to monuments to the core values of American society. Values such as freedom, justice, and union as expressed by our founding fathers. Alternatively, if and when it is discovered that a monument or statue in a public place does not represent those basic values, it is incumbent upon us to take those statues down and move them to some more appropriate location. Albert Pike was an avowed racist. He supported the Confederate Army in its efforts to split America in two countries, one slave and one free. Pike was an officer in the Confederate Army that slaughtered thousands of Union soldiers that were left dead on the battlefields of the Civil War in places such as Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Nashville, and Fort Pillow. At war's end, Pike opposed the three Civil War amendments: the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, 14th Amendment that made African American citizens, and the 15th Amendment that gave blacks the right to vote. Against the right to vote, he argued that, quote, the white race and that race alone shall govern this country. As Confederates defeated on the battlefields of the Civil War, Pike would join other rebel officers such as Nathan Bedford Forrest in establishing the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was a terrorist organization that hanged blacks, burned their schools and churches, destroyed their hard-earned wealth in places such as Tulsa, Oklahoma. There are many monuments, markers, public buildings, roads, and highways named for traitors such as Jefferson Davis, Bobby Lee, and Albert Pike, but few to no such monuments, especially to blacks and their white officers who remain loyal to the Union Army and helped President Abraham Lincoln maintain his avowed dream of one nation under God. On July 18th, just a few days ago, we celebrated the 22nd anniversary of the establishment of the African American Civil War Museum in Washington, D.C. July 18th, 1998 was chosen as the inauguration date for the memorial because it was also the anniversary of the Battle of Fort Wagner, the battle about which the movie Glory was made. Everybody remembers Glory. The African American Civil War Museum lists the names of 209,145 U.S. colored troops and their white officers who joined President Lincoln in the Civil War to fight for freedom and union. The monument was built on federal lands with private funds and was authorized by a bill introduced by my Congresswoman, Eleanor Holmes Norton, who's a friend of mine from the Civil Rights Movement back in the day. The African American Civil War Museum, which is across the street from the monument in Washington, is expanding into an adjacent Rimke building where it will triple the size of its exhibits by the end of this year. One new exhibit will feature 2 USCT soldiers related to First Lady Michelle Obama, whose names are listed on the Memorial Wall of Honor. As an added feature, we've also commissioned a 6-foot-tall statue to the memory of President Abraham Lincoln, which freezes Lincoln in a moment in history when he is signing the Emancipation Proclamation. Paragraph 8 of that proclamation reads, persons of suitable condition will be enlisted into the Union Army. That, by the way, for the ranking member from Utah, that statue was done by a man named Stanley Watts from Kearns, Utah. We've acquired the Lincoln statue already. We have it in storage at the museum, awaiting final installation later this year. It is available for public viewing at any time by appointment only. I rise today to support this bill. I think it's time for us to remove this. And let me say, in the name of our friend John Lewis, whose name should be spoken today in this chamber at least one time, we all know that we have a given point in our lives. All of us will leave some things undone. This is something that was left undone. And so in honor of John Lewis and all the people that he stood for, let us get these monuments down. Thank you very much. May God continue to bless all of you, and may God continue to bless America.
Thank you so much. The chair now recognizes Dr. Joseph LeConte, Director of the B. Kenneth Simon Center for American Studies at the Heritage Foundation.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Curtis, for inviting me to participate in today's hearing. I think what's happening here in this room is how we in our local communities should approach the debate over America's monuments through peaceful, democratic processes. The sins of slavery and racism have left some deep scars on our nation, as they have in many other nations throughout history. In the protests that we've witnessed around the country, there are no doubt many people involved whose intentions are good, whose aim, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, is to bind up the nation's wounds. That's a noble goal. But there's nothing noble about the unlawful assaults on our historic monuments. There's nothing admirable about violent mobs taking over city streets, destroying businesses, and terrorizing civilian populations. This is not the way to bind up the nation's wounds. There are forces in this country, in the mob mentality in our streets, in the media, and the academy that seek to erase, to distort, and to pervert our history. They want to manipulate the past so they can bring about a future in line with their radical political vision. And every day, we're seeing more clearly what that vision looks like on the ground. It represents not only a breakdown in law and order, it is that. It is also an assault on the ideals and the institutions that have sustained our democracy and our civilization over the centuries. It's the rush of the mob over rational, democratic debate. How else do we explain the attacks on the statues of Christopher Columbus, George Washington, Frederick Douglass, the Emancipation statue just down the street here in Lincoln Park? My job as an historian is to try to understand the past, the good, the bad, and the ugly. To the mob, though, virtually everything in our past is ugly, the product of oppression and racism. To them, virtually all of our heroes were villains. All of our institutions were simply a social construction to protect the people in power. The problem with this outlook is not only that it's cynical and conspiratorial, but that it cuts us off from our cultural inheritance. The cancel culture in its rage, it robs us of what Lincoln called the mystic chords of memory. There's a phrase, the mystic chords of memory. It keeps us from learning about the tragedies and the triumphs of our civilization, our remarkable achievements in bringing about a more just and democratic society. The mob mentality prevents us from developing the quality of character we most desperately need: gratitude. Gratitude. There's a lot to be thankful for when we consider the history of the United States in its fullness. As someone who has studied Western civilization, I can tell you that when the United States emerged onto the world stage, we introduced, like no one had ever attempted, the concepts of human freedom, equality, and government by consent of the governed. And no nation has done more to advance these democratic ideas both at home and abroad. That is a profound part of our history, and we need to remember it. The story of our nation, our civilization, will continue to reveal itself as a tale of tragedy and triumph, of war and peacemaking, of slavery and freedom, of moral depravity and moral beauty. The mob mentality sees only one thing. It does not see that shining city on a hill. It sees the dark kingdom of Mordor. How do we bind up the nation's wounds? We could begin by remembering with honesty and integrity our past. The American Declaration of Independence, for the first time in history, proclaimed that a nation was coming into existence as the sworn enemy of human slavery, the enemy of human slavery. The American Revolution put the institution of slavery on notice all over the world. Its days would be numbered, and no other political revolution in the history of mankind ever made such a claim. And maybe no civil rights leader understood this fact better than the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Let me read you a few lines from his letter from Birmingham jail. One day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for what is best in the American dream and for the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage. His words, not mine. Our Judeo-Christian heritage, thereby bringing our nation back to those great wells of democracy dug deep by the founding fathers in their formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. You have to admire a man who endured what Dr. King endured and yet refused to become embittered and cynical about America's past and what she stood for. Dr. King refused to join the mob. The goal of America is freedom, he said. The goal of America is freedom. In the history of the world, friends, that is quite a story worth remembering and worth defending. Thanks for listening.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Christy Coleman, public historian.
To members of the House Committee on Natural Resources, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about H.R. 7550 at the request of Congressman McEachin. I'm deeply honored for the opportunity. I have to start by saying a Pew Research study done just a few years ago found that 48% of survey respondents believed that the cause of the American Civil War was states' rights, compared to only 38% who noted slavery as its root cause. Public and academic historians have long attested that the states' rights argument was and is deeply intertwined with slavery and the protection of it as evidenced from a plethora of primary sources. From the turn of the 20th century, curricula were set by states and localities, but for children raised in the South, like myself, the United Daughters of the Confederacy actually said what our learning should be. They issued detailed guidelines for the rejection of any text or book that, among other things, quote, calls the Confederate soldier a traitor or rebel, and the war a rebellion, that says the South fought to keep her slaves, that speaks of the slaveholder of the South as cruel and unjust to his slaves, end quote. The earliest Civil War monuments and markers were placed in the immediate aftermath of the war to honor the dead. The federal government oversaw reburial of 300,000 plus dead in 73 national cemeteries established for that purpose. The largest federal cemetery was established at Arlington, the plantation home of Robert E. Lee. When federal troops seized the property, they would eventually designate it a cemetery in 1864 with the intent to humiliate Lee. They wanted Arlington to serve as a permanent reminder of the carnage wrought upon the nation by Lee's decision to wage war against the nation he swore an oath to defend and protect against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Outraged by what they perceived as the Union's disregard for their dead, memorial societies led by middle to upper class white women organized to rectify the situation. They initially built modest monuments and cemeteries to serve as reminders of the sacrifices of their dead, like their counterparts in the North. But the scale would grow considerably after Reconstruction, 1877. The constructions of statues, monuments, and other symbols grew on public land after the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson and through the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan through 1915. The next significant building occurred between the 1940s and the 1960s, coinciding with Southern resistance to the U.S. Supreme Court's Brown v. Board decision. It was during that period that the majority of schools, roads, and public buildings were renamed for Confederate military or political figures. We also cannot dismiss the fact that the lost cause narrative gained greater validation even through World War II, when the United States War Department named military bases for Confederates. The federal government positioned these renamings, the naming of these bases, as a gesture of reconciliation. Unfortunately, it had the effect of legitimizing a rebellion against the United States. To be clear, the rejection of this reframing is not a new phenomenon. Public figures and scholars at the time these were being built railed against them. In fact, among the earliest was eloquently spoken about in 1877 by Frederick Douglass. He said, quote, "We must not be asked to say that the South was right in the rebellion or that the North was wrong. We must not be asked to put difference between those who fought for the Union and those who fought against it, or between loyalty and treason," end quote. The societal upheavals of the 1950s and 60s also challenged this status quo interpretation of the American Civil War and its enduring legacies and disenfranchisement of millions of American citizens. For African Americans, religious and other ethnic minorities, the Confederate flag has long been and continues to be associated with violence inflicted upon them and their allies. Throughout the current discussion, one refrain is often repeated, and you just heard it. We shouldn't erase a history by removing these items from the public landscape. The fact is, the history was already erased when these items were erected. Subsequently, how Americans remember the Civil War is remembered and interpreted for the entire nation has been skewed. With that said, I do say this. When asked what should we do in thinking about monuments moving forward, let's be clear. We should absolutely have monuments that reflect our shared values of justice and equality. But we can't do that if we're continuing to think that what we have on our current landscape represents that. Thank you for allowing me time to speak today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Coleman. Thank you for that valuable testimony, reminding the members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. And I will start with my colleague, Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for holding this important hearing. And thanks to our witnesses for some very powerful testimony. I have long advocated for the removal of Confederate symbols on our federal lands in 2015 and 2016 when I first offered amendments to end the display of Confederate battle flags at our nation's federal cemeteries managed by the National Park Service. It was an uphill battle to even get floor consideration in this House. It divided the Republican conference so much that they literally shut down the appropriations process rather than put their members publicly on record with a vote over what they thought about these Confederate symbols. But we are in a new era today, hopefully with John Lewis's life and legacy fresh in our minds. And we have seen widespread public support for the removal of Confederate statues. Even the Pentagon seems to be getting a little bit woke on these subjects. And so I think it is important that we fully investigate all aspects of our government and how, in the name of this country, we're using Confederate symbols, including in the United States Capitol and military bases and public lands. These bills we're discussing today will continue that momentum for change. And I'm pleased to be part of that. These memorials and statues certainly speak to who we as a nation used to be, but what we choose to do with them now speak to who we are today. So again, thanks for great testimony from our witnesses. And if I could start with Reverend Lee. Reverend, you are such a powerful messenger on these subjects. Thank you so much for doing this. I think you show that we don't have to honor dark aspects of our heritage by walking in the same footsteps as ancestors who got it wrong. And that is a great contribution, I think, to this moment. So let me ask you, can you briefly explain why you felt so compelled to speak out about the issues involving Confederate statues and symbols?
For me, sir, it was one of those things that it involved redemption and reconciliation and even reparation, and acknowledging that for me, this isn't about me. I'm a white dude. I can walk by these statues and not feel a thing, and that's actually really dangerous in this current climate, that I, as a person who can just walk by this statue, not feel a thing, whereas someone who is in my community can walk by on the way to vote and see a Confederate statue and still experience such hatred and violence and oppression.
Well, thank you for that. Mayor Landrieu, you gave a heck of a speech a couple of years ago when you removed the last of New Orleans Confederate monuments. I'll quote it if I could. To literally put these statues were intended to literally put the Confederacy on a pedestal in our most prominent places of honor, and that is an inaccurate recitation of our full past. It's an affront to our present, and it's a bad prescription for our future. Could you please explain what you meant when you said that Confederate statues are an inaccurate recitation of our full past and an affront to our present?
Thank you so much. One of the things that self-appointed historians articulated in opposition to us taking down the monuments was that somehow we were erasing history. When in reality, those monuments only reflected an inaccurate recitation of only 4 years. New Orleans, as you know, was founded in 1718. We had a very long history. We celebrated our 300th anniversary the other day. And what happened was we only had a recitation of our past for 4 years of it. And there were no public symbols of all of the other people that helped make New Orleans the great multicultural city that she has become. And so in that essence, they took a piece of property and they took all of our history and tried to communicate to people that that was the clear history of who we were. I think that that is historical malfeasance. Many people say that we should add to what it is that we have. Well, if that's true, why has that never been done? And why are our most prominent spaces kept for people that tried to destroy America rather than to lift it up? Those monuments did not seem to be a reflection of who New Orleans ever was, much less who New Orleans ever wanted to be, which is why the people of New Orleans voted to allow me to use my authority to take them down.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thanks again to our witnesses and to Chair Holland for this important discussion. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman. The chair recognizes Ranking Member Curtis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to thank our witnesses and Dr. Conte. I've got a couple questions for you. And I want to preface my questions with this. I truly hope that nobody will interpret from my line of questioning that I oppose the bills before us today. I support what's happening, and I think these are important conversations that we're having. But I do continually ask in my mind what our standard is. And how do we know when we've crossed that standard, and how do we not know? And when this hearing came up, I remember very clearly a subcommittee meeting of this subcommittee where we were considering the Chicano Park Preservation Act. And I pointed out that the murals in this park that we were protecting featured controversial figures like Fidel Castro. And I asked the NPS Deputy Secretary, Vela, to comment on the National Park Service's agenda, try to represent all people, and did this concern them? And the response was, within the narrative of the national parks, we tell a lot of stories and demonstrate a lot of images and narratives. Through educational interpretation, we're able to provide the visitors with a better understanding of why those images exist, why those exact statues exist, and enable them an opportunity to develop their own thoughts as to the particular item they're looking at. I asked the majority's witnesses on the bill a similar question and asked her to help me understand the possible comparisons such as today's statues. She said that there was little need for concern because there are more than 100 murals in the park, that they were only two featuring controversial people. If we use that same model, which I think we should, to be consistent, a quick Google search says that there are 116 statues in the Washington, D.C., and probably thousands throughout the national park system. And so really the question I bring before the committee today is, what is our standard so we'll know it when we see it, right? When we've crossed that line of when a statue should be removed and when it shouldn't. And how much in an individual's life, at what level does it disqualify them to be honored for other accomplishments that they may have had? And Doctor, I don't know if you could help me on that, because I think it's important for this committee. We'll be here again looking at other statues and other figures, and they may or may not meet the high level that we're looking at those today of controversy. And I'm just kind of curious from your perspective how you'd answer that question.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Curtis, for that question. It's a great question. I'll take a stab at it. I mean, one of my real concerns is the level of civic illiteracy. And I think it was Christy Coleman who referred to it, the ignorance of so many young people not even knowing what the Civil War was about, much less when it was fought. Same can be said for the First World War and the Second World War. Having taught students at the King's College there in New York City for a decade, it is really appalling, the kind of civic amnesia that we have. So on the one level, you can say that, you know, monuments can be a teaching moment. Every monument can be a teaching moment. How do you decide which one should be publicly displayed? Well, in terms of monuments that clearly are directing our hearts and minds to honoring an individual, that's one thing. What individuals we want to honor in our public and civic life? Well, those who are defending the democratic principles that we all agree to: freedom, equality, government by consent of the governed. If that individual is a defender of those principles, was a defender of those principles, then sure, we want to honor that person. If the person is not a defender of those principles, I don't know that the answer is to take them out of the public square, but I do think the answer is certainly to give us the context, the historical, contextualize that person and use it as a teaching moment, because the level of ignorance, civic ignorance about our own history is appalling. And what I'm increasingly worried about is if the ordinary young person can't even name the three branches of government, And we're hearing surveys like that from Pew Forum and elsewhere. If you can't even name the three branches of government, you are more susceptible to propaganda. And I don't want to see that happen in this country, and I think we're running the risk of that. So contextualize the monuments rather than necessarily removing them from sight. Teach the history. Teach it honestly with integrity would be my encouragement, if that's helpful.
That seemed to be the answer I was getting at the time from the majority and the witnesses. And yet I too I have a lot of sympathy with their points made today with these statues, that they're very offensive. In my open remarks, I alluded to this, and I don't mind bringing it up again. I grew up as a white male in Utah in the 60s and 70s. I'm part of that ignorance of the Civil War, right? And this has been very educational for me. And I'm trying with a really sincere heart to understand these issues. And I welcome the other members of that committee on both sides to have thoughtful dialogue about this. And I don't mind saying sometimes it's a dangerous dialogue. You don't feel like you can even ask questions. And so I appeal to all the members of this committee to keep having thoughtful conversations that are safe, that allow us to ask these questions in a way without seeming like we're trying to be problematic or even racist. And Madam Chair, I regret that I'm out of time. I yield my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Curtis. The chair recognizes Mrs. Dingle.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to everybody for being here for this hearing today and convening an important hearing to discuss how appropriately to honor our nation's heritage on America's public lands. There are currently over 1,700 Confederate symbols on public lands, and we do need to do an honest accounting of our nation's history to address these painful monuments and promote inclusive imagery that represents all Americans. Our current national moment has placed renewed scrutiny on the appropriateness of Confederacy imagery on America's public lands, and dozens of these have already been removed legally in the last few weeks following George Floyd's murder in May. And following the bipartisan action by Mississippi state legislators and governor, the state removed its Confederate symbol from the state flag in favor of a new flag that promotes unity rather than division. So it's my hope that this committee and this Congress uses this moment in time in history to promote symbols that bring us together as Americans rather than divide us through the use of Confederate imagery that sanitizes the ugly racism of the cause. So let me start with one of my favorite people, Mayor Mitch Landrieu, who it's wonderful to see you. Someday I'll see you not in a box. But Mayor Landrieu, you mentioned in your testimony that Confederate symbols, including the ones mentioned in the legislation today, were constructed in the 20th century. What was the purpose of building these Confederate monuments long after the end of the Civil War?
Well, as Professor LeConte told us just a moment ago, so many people are ignorant of our history and our full history. Many people think that these things were put up immediately after the Civil War, when in fact, they began to get erected in the 1890s, and they have not stopped being erected until just a few years ago. These were all part of an effort to rewrite history by something called the Lost Cause, which was an effort to make the cause of the Civil War noble. It was really a propaganda campaign. It was started generally by the Daughters of the Confederacy that were intended to rewrite history, as one of the other witnesses said, to actually rewrite the history books so that we did not learn what the really total part of our history was about. And as a consequence, they were strewn all over the place. I can't think of another country that has people who fought the country in places of reverence. And as Professor LeConte said, there is clearly a difference between remembrance and reverence. We should never forget the Civil War. We should never forget the people who fought on behalf of the Civil War, and we should never forget why they did it. But to put them in places of reverence, in primary places, in major cities, in our nation's capital, seems to be antithetical to every sense of not only decency, but correct historical perspective. And that's why you can correct those errors without forgetting about the past. Clearly, we want to remember it. We want to remember it for the right reason so that we never repeat it, not revere it so that we actually do it again.
You know, when you were mayor, New Orleans, and before we've come to this moment of time, you removed 4 statues linked to the Confederacy that were in prominent places throughout the city. Looking back on the decision you made before we were here at this moment, how has the removal of these statues helped the city and its residents more honestly reckon with your past?
Well, first, yes, thank you so much for that. The reason we did it was because we were actually looking forward. We were getting ready to celebrate our 300th anniversary. And we had a mantra after the city having been destroyed by Katrina. We didn't want to put the city back like it was. We wanted to take an honest look at our past, and we wanted to build the city that we should have been had we gotten it right the first time. And when we did that honest dive, deep dive on who we were, what we had historically been, what we wanted to be, we came to a reckoning that we weren't living by the words that we were holding ourselves up to be as part of the American landscape, always trying to become that more perfect union. Those monuments stood out like a sore thumb and actually just kind of presented themselves as something that had to be moved if New Orleans ever wanted to become the city that she always promised that she would be, which is a great city where diversity is a strength, not a weakness, where we in New Orleans believe that we represent this nation's motto, out of many, we are one. Now, what we did do, though, is we had 4 public hearings. We also, after the public hearings, when the legislature acted and then I, the chief executive, signed the order, the third branch of government was brought in through the courts. We actually went through 7 court hearings, 13 separate judges, and there were appeals to the legislature and the federal government to stop it. So we went through the agonizing process, the deliberative process, the peaceful process of getting to the other side. And as a consequence, the people of the city of New Orleans have a much deeper understanding of who we are, where we are, and where we want to go. And we would commend it to the country as a process that we should use to think through what we do next.
Thank you. I'm out of time, but that's a lesson the country could take value from too. Thank you.
Thank
Yield
you.
back,
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Dingle. It has come to my attention that members will have to go and vote on the floor. I was hoping I could avoid that, but I am running out of time here. I apologize for the inconvenience. The subcommittee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair. We'll reconvene as soon as I get back from voting. to order. And the chair will recognize Mr. Horsford for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for holding this hearing today. You know, this has been a very difficult week for all of us, and as we mourn the loss of Congressman John Lewis of Georgia, a hero to so many of us, a champion for equality, we must too remember the sacrifice and legacy he and so many other Americans made in fighting for our civil rights and freedoms. When discussing the removal of Confederate monuments, Congressman Lewis described these efforts as, quote, the beginning of a movement that will help us move towards the realization that we're one people, we're one nation, and we have to be sensitive to our own history, unquote. Just this week, we in the House of Representatives are honoring this movement in the nation's capital by voting on historic legislation that will remove the statues of defenders of the horrific system of slavery, segregation, and racism from the U.S. Capitol building. I am proud of the work our chair and all of our colleagues are doing to demonstrate that our public lands and parks belong to all Americans. This is an opportunity to shine our light on stories of great individuals who have not stood for hate or oppression or against our union, but rather those who reflect our ideas and those whose valuable contributions built the fabric of our nation. Dr. Coleman, thank you for being here and for the important work that you're doing to inform us of our own history. For those who may not understand these symbols or the impact that they have, can you please share with us some stories or experiences that you've heard working on this issue? What do these statues mean to Americans, and particularly Black Americans, when they are held in places of honor?
Thank you, sir, for your question. The simple answer is the response that I'm hearing, and I've been working in this issue for a number of years. Part of my background was serving as CEO of the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, Virginia, where these conversations have been taking place in earnest really since 2009, when we began preparing for the sesquicentennial of the American Civil War. And Richmond is by far ground zero. It is the place where the Lost Cause was born and fed. It is the place where we saw the nation's first and largest monument built to Robert E. Lee that went up in 1890, designed specifically to stand taller than George Washington's statue, which is on the Commonwealth of Virginia's Capitol grounds. To African Americans, this has been an affront from day one. And it is for them, more often than not, a simple question. And that question is, where would you like the world to place the monument of the person who kidnapped your children, your ancestors, beat, raped, killed them? Where would be the appropriate place? How do you think that this particular item is going to help us better understand a history? And so, especially, again, when they're placed in such veneration. I also acknowledge, again, having worked at the American Civil War Museum, that there are those individuals who have felt that these monuments and the people to whom they represent are actually displays of other types of values, valor, standing for one's home, etc. And frankly, all of that is a part of the lost cause narrative that was created. So, you know, I, as a museum
Thank you, Dr.
executive,
Coleman.
yes, I'm sorry, thank you.
Mayor Landrieu, I want to thank you for your testimony and your continued work to remove inappropriate memorials to the Confederacy across the United States. For many Americans, this debate is about history and preserving our past. They see the removal of these statues as a radical act to remove our history. So if you had the opportunity to speak to someone holding those views on this issue, what would you say to them? What words would you leave with them?
I would really just say simply to them, who we choose to remember and revere is as important as who we have forgotten, and that our history is much deeper and much broader. It's much richer than the very narrow history that they chose to remember, and that there are lots of us in this country, and the truth spans across time, that we ought to, if we want to be fully American, we ought to remember all of our history. And revering, as I have said, is very different from remembering. We should always remember so that we never repeat. Reverence is saved for those who I think represent the best values that America has to offer.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Horsford. The chair recognizes Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really want to thank you for this hearing. I hope you can hear me. I have a question for Dr. Smith, but I also want to make sure I understood Dr. LeConte's testimony. I think we all agree, I certainly agree with him, that the takedown of mobs by mobs or crowds of monuments is a most inappropriate way to do it. Do I understand Dr. LeConte to agree that these museums should be taken down and perhaps put in museums?
Well, thank you for that question. I guess as an historian, I'm not a policy guy, but I think my great concern is that we understand the context of these things, that we use the monuments as a teaching moment, not elevate people who we all can agree were on the wrong side of history, the wrong side of these important questions. We don't want to valorize that. I'm going to leave it to others to sort out what's the best way to teach the history honestly with integrity.
Well, I appreciate it, because I couldn't agree with you more. Even just putting them in a museum would not be sufficient unless there was around those monuments the story of what they stood for, what their history meant, and an objective story for that matter. Dr. Smith, I want to thank you for being here as well. Now, you may know that the Department of Interior has indicated that the department opposes efforts to remove Confederate symbols from public spaces, and I want to read to you how they frame it. They frame it: history is not ours alone. It belongs to the generations of the past, present, and future to serve as a collective national memory. What do you think of the department's position?
Well, it's hard for me to discuss this without thinking about it as a Black person, an African American. Born in Georgia, went to college in 1959, part of the Civil Rights Movement, went to jail with you and John Lewis and other people. And so every time I pass by one of these monuments, every time I drive down Robert E. Lee Highway, I feel like the public is not being injustice. So it's hard for me to talk about the Park Service position without looking at it that way. So although it sounds like they don't care what we think, they don't care what African Americans think, they don't care how our blood boils when we walk past these things. And what we're seeing now is with the Black Lives Movement, there's a public uprising against these things, because it's taken us so long to get this done. They're starting to take matters into their own hands. And so I think the urgency, that means that there's some urgency, but there's some urgency about what we're doing now. If we don't want the law to do this, we must do the orderly process as you're doing. Got to get these things done.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. And the department frames its opposition more delicately, but the president has said that not only does he want them down, those that were taken down, he wants put back up. So I do think there's a civil way to do this. There's a way to keep from forgetting. To forget would be an atrocity. This is a bit of our history that very much needs to be remembered. The question before us is how that remembrance should take place. And I thank you again, Madam Chair, for this hearing and for allowing me to wave on to the committee to ask my own questions. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Norton. The chair recognizes Mr. Brown for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mayor Landrieu, I want to thank you for testifying today and for your work in this area. Mr. Huffman referenced, as maybe did others, your most eloquent speech in May of 2017. And in that speech, you also stated, while some have driven by these monuments every day and either revered their beauty or failed to see them at all, many of our neighbors and fellow Americans see them very clearly. Many are painfully aware of the long shadows their presence casts, not only literally but figuratively, and they clearly receive the message that the Confederacy and the cult of the lost cause intended to deliver. So you during your tenure, you removed 4 Confederate statues. You were the mayor of a southern city with a minority population. And you may have testified to this, but I apologize because many members are having to leave at different times to go vote. So I apologize if the question is redundant, but why was it important to you to remove these statutes, even in the face of national backlash and criticism?
Well, first of all, the city of New Orleans, as I had testified previously, was preparing for its 300th anniversary. When you do that, you try to take stock of your history, who you are. If you're a discerning group of people, you think about where you've been and where you're going, and you ask yourself whether you've been living with integrity. These monuments were not in distant places. They were right smack in the middle of the city in its most prominent places that would reflect to people who came there that that's what the people of the city actually believed. And nothing could be further from the truth. As I had said previously, they only represented 4 years of our history, and it was an accurate recitation because the place where the Lee statue was actually where the Union troops slept. And so if we wanted to reflect the history of New Orleans, its totality, its melting pot, its diversity, those monuments were clearly a historical lie. And so it was important, if the city of New Orleans wanted to live with integrity, if we believed that out of many that we were one, that we adorned our public spaces and revered those values that made us who we were. And they stuck out like a sore thumb. So it was really important for the city, not just to get rid of the monuments, but to think about the ideas that put them up and the institutional biases that existed in our systems going forward. And I would recommend that for the country as well, to do a deep dive and to think about how the country is actually divided by design and how we make institutional changes to make America available for everybody.
Thank you. Reverend Lee, thank you for your appearance today. Can you expand and elaborate on the point that you made in your op-ed in the Washington Post, where you stated, many of my fellow Southerners are afraid that if we remove Confederate monuments, we will forget the legacy of Lee and our Southern heritage. If we are honest with ourselves, many of those fears are anxiety about a shifting way of life, a loss of a certain understanding. What is the certain understanding and its loss to which you refer?
Well, Congressman, I think many of my fellow Southerners especially have this mentality that we have always had a way that it's always been. You go down yonder back where I live, and if you ask them how to cook that way, it's always been that way. You ask them how you raise children, it's always been that way. And that's not to oversimplify things. It's just to state that we have a way of doing things. Unfortunately, in the genesis of that way of doing things, we realized that white people could take advantage of, could oppress, and could show racism and white supremacy to black people. And for many people, we think we're past that, but we still take advantage of those systems that oppress because it's always been that way. So for us, we have to chart a new course, a new vision, a new way of doing life together. And for some people, that's just downright scary.
Thank you. Dr. LeConte, I'm so pleased with your response to Eleanor Holmes Norton, my colleague from the District of Columbia, because I was concerned during your testimony. You began, you included in the middle, and you seem to have finished with an emphasis on mob rule, which is so far from the deliberative process that we are engaged in here in Congress. And I do agree with you that we need to value and respect and honor the values of freedom and fairness. And I guess the question for you is, as an historian, is it appropriate for Congress to take up the consideration of this issue. In many cases, statues and monuments erected in previous generations on different pretenses, different reasons. Is it appropriate for this body that reflects the will of the people to deliberate on whether we should remove them or not?
Thank you for that question, sir. I do appreciate it. Sorry about that. The democratic process is what I'm so excited about that's happening here in this room. And so whether it's at a federal level, at a local level, what I'm concerned about as an historian who's looked at different movements, social movements, mob rule is a dangerous thing, and I don't think we should take it lightly. I don't want to overemphasize it, but it doesn't take many bad actors really to turn a city into chaos or to bring a nation down. I mean, I've been living in Washington, D.C. for the last 20 years. I've never seen so many.
Well, let me just reclaim my time. I didn't really want a recitation or recite of your concern with mob rule, because I don't think there's anyone in this room that is not concerned with mob rule. And we also, most of us in this room, distinguish that from peaceful protest. But we understand, you know, that there were perhaps some unlawful takedown of statues. That's not my question.
Yeah.
My question is this deliberative process that may very well result in the removal of statues. Is that legitimate for Congress to do? Yes or no?
It's a legitimate democratic, and it has to be done democratically. Absolutely, sir. Yeah.
Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. And I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. LeConte, you mentioned in your testimony that statues of Christopher Columbus are being targeted by protesters, and you mentioned the statues of Columbus along with George Washington, and so it seemingly as if those statues should remain untouchable. And I want to tell you why protesters are targeting statues of Christopher Columbus. I'm a 35th generation New Mexican. Christopher Columbus murdered thousands of indigenous people when he came over to this part of the world. And he opened the door for Europe to come and colonize this continent when millions of indigenous people had lived here since time immemorial. They brought disease, they brought violence and oppression and genocide. This country is founded on genocide, which in my opinion, I have a minor in history, certainly not a major, which is a precursor to how they would treat the slaves when they brought Africans over here to work and make people rich. And so I just want to say that because I couldn't let this hearing go by without mentioning that. So thank you. And Ms. Coleman, my question is for you. Although the bills included in today's hearing focus on the commemorative works glorifying Confederate leaders who championed the continued enslavement and brutalization of Black Americans, there are countless other places throughout the nation that bear the names of individuals responsible for committing horrific atrocities. Ms. Coleman, based on your research, would you say that offensive or derogatory place names and sites is a larger issue that goes beyond Confederate statues?
Yes, the simple answer is yes, I do. As you just mentioned about Columbus and others, there is a horrific past there. I am appreciative of our need to know all of these things. What disturbs me the most in these conversations is when people say that the removal of these objects is somehow taking away the history. We know that King George III was king of these 13 colonies before the American Revolution. Every single statue of him was taken down by the people, not a deliberative process. Our nation was born out of civil and social unrest, at sometimes turning into protest and damage of property, nay, the Boston Tea Party. So what I think becomes important for us to understand is that we have to be mindful as we look forward and as we look back on the past to determine, again, which values we want to set forward. We are not going to forget the atrocities. We can't. But when we venerate figures who are responsible for those atrocities, that in and of itself is an erasure. I will say that I may be alone in this, but there are individuals that I do believe, even in their imperfect selves, and this isn't about presentism, this is about the realities, that there are individuals that gave us founding language of being a better place, of having a more perfect union that we can cling to, even if they did not. So again, I think it is incumbent upon communities to make these decisions for themselves, and where deliberative processes can take place, that they do. But I also am keenly aware, as a person in public history, that communities often disenfranchise voices. They only pick people that they want to hear from. So we have to be careful of that too.
Ms. Coleman, in your opinion, what should Congress's role be in addressing this issue? In other words, how should we be thinking about this issue programmatically?
Well, I think first and foremost, you got to understand what you have. And once you understand what you have, then you can begin the process of which of these things best align. I do think that the battlefields are a little different because they do have figures for all sides. What is often missing from those battlefields, however, is any representation of the 200,000 plus African-American men who served. What's also missing is the 16 different Native nations that aligned with the United States against the Confederacy. Those things are missing. So that's where I think the additive role becomes more important.
Thank you so much, Ms. Coleman, and I yield and would like to recognize Mr. Huffman for another question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to go off of my prepared materials and just see if I might ask a question to the great panelists we have here today who have worked so hard on these reckonings with symbols from the Confederacy. Far away from the military base named Fort Bragg on the other side of the country, I represent a bucolic little community on the California coast named Fort Bragg. And it's a little interesting quirk of history for those who would look at it as some sort of historic significance. It was named before the Civil War, but there's no connection between Braxton Bragg and this community. He never set foot there, never went anywhere close to it. It inherited this name just on a historic lark, and it has continued for generations. Well, fast forward to 2020. We're having an interesting conversation in the community of Fort Bragg, which is a wonderful, kind, and non-racist community that is grappling with the fact that they've got a really bad name that doesn't represent at all who they are or who they've ever been. But a lot of folks have nostalgia and memories and other things attached to that name. And so I'd like to ask any of our panelists who want to speak to this, what they would say to this community I represent that is struggling in its own way in this moment that our country is in to figure out what to do about this particular anachronistic symbol that, like it or not, exalts a Confederate hero, Braxton Bragg. Yeah, Reverend Lee.
We've spoke a lot about Congressman John Lewis, and I actually had the opportunity to preach to him at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, the historic church that Martin Luther King was pastor of. And as I was going up, he actually was dancing to On Time God, which is a song by Dottie Peebles, where she says he's an on-time God. And I believe by divine providence, we have been given an opportunity to respond to the fact that nostalgia does not equal our ability to want to change things. We should want to change things and not be complicit through our nostalgia. That is the most dangerous thing we can do. It's always been that way. You know, I'm a pastor. I have to deal with that in the church. People say, well, gosh, it's always been that way. We can't change it. That for me is a non-starter. That's a no-go. We have to have this conversation now.
Mayor Landrieu, do you have any thoughts you might be willing to share if you're still with us?
Yeah, I do. I do. Thank you. I would just not to pretend to be a reverend, but I'm always mindful of God's grace. Always gives us a chance for renewal and to think about who we are and what we are. Clearly, from a process point of view, that is a local decision that should be made by that community, not by the federal government, certainly not by Congress. I agree with Reverend Lee, though, that holding on to nostalgia for nostalgia purposes is useless. I think communities really should think about who they are and what values they are. And there is consequence to living under the shadow of someone that fought to destroy the country for the sake of preserving slavery, even though it may be historically weird that somebody so far, some community so far away from the South was named after a Confederate general. It's a decision that the community has to make, but if I were a member of the community, having learned what I have learned and knowing what I know now, I would prefer to change the name.
Appreciate that. Anyone else care to comment?
Yes, this is Frank Smith with the African American Civil War Memorial in Washington, D.C. Yeah, I think this is an opportunity for the community to talk about this and to rethink itself and to come up with some name that might more appropriately fit the values that that community holds today. And I think this is that makes this an important discussion. I do think I saw something from Dr. David Blight in the Washington Post a few weeks ago saying that you need to build some more monuments. I'm on that side. We have a monument to President Abraham Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation. He said we should put them up all over the country. I agree with that. So we need to, somebody needs to pay some attention to trying to get some things up on the landscape that represent the most important period in the history of this country, which is the Civil War, which changed this country from a country that supported slavery, built on slavery, to a country where it could talk about freedom. So an important document, it's an important time in our history. We have to find a way to talk about it that brings us all together, because this is a great nation that came out of it, and we ought to be able to talk about it in a way that makes sense.
Those are great thoughts. I'm out of time, but Madam Chair, thanks so much for indulging that additional question, and thanks to the panelists again.
Yes, of course. And the chair will recognize Mr. McEachin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to the participants today, I thank you for joining us. Today's hearing is deeply personal for me, both as a proud native of Richmonder and as a student of political history. I believe that our nation's monuments and statues can be unifying symbols of the struggles, sacrifices, and contributions made by all Americans, and a source of shared patriotic pride. Unfortunately, too many Confederate memorials aim to rewrite or glorify the reputation of Confederate leaders, and in turn, they ignore or minimize our nation's violent history of slavery and racism. I have seen the pain that these Confederate monuments cause for my community, and I echo my constituents' demands for the removal of these symbols of hatred and bigotry. Building on my constituents' passionate advocacy, I introduced H.R. 7550, legislation to conduct a full inventory of Confederate commemorative works on our nation's public lands to help evaluate their suitability as resources for the interpretation of the American Civil War. This legislation will enable the federal government to have a clear picture of what works exist, where they are located, and to what extent they are being used appropriately, if at all. Madam Chair, now I'd like to ask Ms. Christie some questions if she's available.
I am.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, Ms. Christy Coleman, I apologize. Ms. Coleman, thank you for speaking about the importance of having a comprehensive picture of what Confederate commemorative works exist on public lands managed by DOD, the VA, and the Department of the Interior. How would you respond to the belief that Confederate monuments located on federally managed lands are fundamentally different in nature from commemorative works placed in public spaces?
You were breaking up a little bit, but I think I understand what you were asking, and that is the difference between on commemorative lands versus public lands. There is a huge difference, again, to me, about the placement of statuary at battlefield sites, for example, or at cemeteries, for example. The problem is when these statues are in public space, i.e. in front of courthouses, in front of police departments, in front of schools, in general parks. It places them in an entirely different context. And that context, I believe, is ultimately harmful. One of the things that I think we have to, again, why I think that your proposal is a good one, you have to identify exactly where they are and how and when they were placed. And that will provide the kinds of answers that are needed to make the determination of the next steps.
Would you try to answer this question for me as well? What comes next after a call for removal, especially as it concerns Confederate monuments on federally managed landscapes? Do you have any recommendations or insights to guide in that part of the process?
Like Mayor Landrieu, in Richmond, Virginia, we did have a process called the Monument Avenue Commission, and it was a deliberative process that lasted about 18 months where we held public hearings, public meetings, took in written works, et cetera, had a team of scholars that were looking at the history behind each and every one of them, presented that information to the public, had partnered with the museums community in Richmond to better educate our community to come up with a decision. And the decisions that community made were actually put in place. The challenge that we had was that in Richmond and in the state of Virginia, there was a law on the books that said that these objects could not be removed. That law was made in 1904, the exact same year that they disenfranchised 95% of Black male voters and half of white voters who were not of a certain income level. So it was no mistake when that law was made, but that was going to take time to change the law, and the law was changed. And so those are the kinds of things that I think every state, again, every community needs to carefully look at.
Thank you, Ms. Coleman. I think my time is about to run out, and I'll just say this: as Americans, we have a responsibility to not only learn from, but confront our history and to strive for a more complete telling of our nation's story. I look forward to working alongside you, Madam Chair, our colleagues, and my constituents in this critical effort. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McEachin. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.